Before I begin my talk, I'd like to thank the Equality Rights Project here at the University of Hong Kong for organizing this conference. And I especially want to thank all of you who have come from across Hong Kong and Taiwan and from mainland China for being here today. This is exciting, and I look forward to learning from you over the next 4 days because I know very little about the way in which disability rights are being localized in East Asia. And so I very much look forward to learning. I also want to thank Jia for her tremendous efforts putting together this conference. And I'd like to thank my former PhD student, Shuxin, who I had such a pleasure working with on her dissertation. And in the year since she's graduated, hearing about her work in Hong Kong. And so it's wonderful to be here to see it. So thank you so much. So today's talk, there we go. Okay, technical difficulties. So today's talk is a critical reflection on the globalization of disability studies as a discipline and its influence on our understanding of disability rights. And I especially appreciate the opening remarks regarding community and localization, because I'm going to make an argument today that the disability studies field and understandings of disability rights reflect the Western society, the Western community. And very little work has been done to localize the ways in which we understand disability experiences in other parts of the world, as well as how we understand disability rights. I'm going to begin today by reviewing the biographies of 3 of the founders of disability studies as a field and disability rights to really see how their specific experiences really form the core of the theory and is reflected in disability studies today. I will then look at the ways in which their experiences became part of the CRPD and the human rights model of disability was institutionalized and diffused globally. I'm particularly interested in the way individualism and the autonomous self animates the social model of disability and emphasis on independent living. I will next look at what I call the civil society mandate of disability rights, which imagines disability organizations as being centered on legal advocacy. I believe that the emphasis on individualism is a reflection of Western assumptions regarding what constitutes agency. And in the case of civil society as advocate, it is a reflection of specifically Western understandings of the state, and therefore has not only limited the full universalization of disability studies and disability rights in their current form, but ignored important aspects of interdependence and communitarian forms of living that equally promote agency, and ignores the full diversity of civil society to address the barriers that persons with disabilities address through the grassroots associations and formal and informal organizations and networks they have founded at the local level. In short, I think there's a lot that the West can learn about both the disability experience and disability emancipation from the rest of the world. To make my argument, I will provide 2 case studies. The first will be on my work with grassroots disability associations in Nicaragua, and the second will be on more recent work in prisons in the United States, where persons with disabilities have created informal networks of care. Oops. There we go. I'd like to begin today by discussing the life experiences of 3 of the most prominent people in establishing disability studies as a discipline, and for creating a disability movement focused on rights. The reason for doing this is because I believe the unique experiences of specific individuals have had an outsized influence in forming the universalist assumptions that inform disability studies today, and also explain the role of civil society and disability rights instruments, such as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The first 2 people I'd like to talk about are Paul Hunt and Vic Finkelstein, who co-founded the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation in the United Kingdom in 1976, and first articulated the social model of disability, which is the analytic foundation of disability studies and a major influence on disability rights, which Mike Oliver, the first professor of disability studies and former founder of the field, used as the keystone for the creation of a new interdisciplinary field. I will then move on to Judy Heumann, who founded one of the first disability rights advocacy organizations in the US, and then went on to be a driving force in changes in American law, and eventually international law through her work supporting the creation of the UN Convention. Paul Hunt, who was born in 1937, began living in a hospital when he was just 13 years old, and because of his muscular dystrophy had progressed, continued to live in an institution into adulthood. In 1966, Hunt co-edited a breakthrough volume called Stigma, The Experience of Disability. In his own chapter in the volume, he opened with, "All my adult life has been spent in institutions amongst people who, like myself, have severe and often progressive physical disabilities. So naturally, this personal experience forms a background to the views on disability that follows." So he's specifically referencing his experience in an institution as informing his understanding of disability and theory that comes from it. The chapter goes on to describe his life as wasting away like a Belsen victim and being denied marriage and a family and forced to live out one's time in an institution. He was particularly aware of the level of control healthcare workers and others had over his life and the lives of other persons with disabilities in the institution with him, writing, "In the hospitals and homes I have lived in, one rarely sees any physical cruelty, but I've experienced enough of other kinds of subtly corrupting behavior. There are administrators and matrons who have had people removed on slight pretexts, who try to break up ordinary friendships if they don't approve of them. There are staff who bully those who cannot complain, who dictate what clothes people should wear, who switch the television off in the middle of a program, and will take away privileges when they choose." While still living in the home, Paul began to actively organize his fellow inmates, with the first campaign being for an increase in Social Security payments for persons with disabilities to create the Independent Living Fund, which would allow people to live independently outside of institutions, so specifically to be able to live alone, but in the community. Paul Hunt's history of living in an institution really imbues disability studies as a theoretical perspective that is organized around a clear binary between dependence and independence, institutionalization and individual freedom. You are either in society or you are segregated off by yourself. Around the same time, he met Vic Finkelstein, and they worked together to found UPIS. Vic Finkelstein's life story was, in many ways, very different from Hunt, yet they reached similar conclusions. Rather than growing up in an institution in the English countryside, Finkelstein, who was born in 1938, grew up at home in South Africa, and at age 16 broke his neck and became paralyzed and was unable to leave his home. He was active in the anti-apartheid movement, which led to him being put in prison, which led to his initial analysis of the state and his understanding of disability as a product of state action or inaction. He would later write, "I was in jail for anti-apartheid activities. This was the only time in South Africa that things were made accessible for me. In jail, I was provided with a bed. Political prisoners slept on a mat on the floor, and assisted with helpers or personal assistants because, of course, the jails were otherwise totally inaccessible. Somehow, when the state has a need, it does make things accessible." Here we can see this simultaneously understanding of states as being repressive, using state power to institutionalize and imprison people, but also a demand that states use their power to change the built environment, provide the services needed, and so forth in order to make the world accessible. He went on to write about after he was released from prison and put under house arrest, which meant he was barred from entering public spaces, saying, in practice, the banning order or the house arrest meant that for 5 years I couldn't do anything. Now, for me, what was interesting is that when I was handed the banning order, I looked at it. I thought, well, this is not going to make much difference in my life because most of the things I'm not allowed to do, I can't do anyway. They're inaccessible. Soon thereafter, in 1968, Finkelstein made his way to the United Kingdom as a political refugee, where he met Paul Hunt and founded the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation and put forward the first version of the social model. In our view, it is society. In our view, it is society which disabled physically impaired people. Disability is something imposed on top of our impairments. By the way, we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. Disabled people are therefore an oppressed group in society. When we read this, we need to see two things behind it. The first is this binary. People are either completely separated off and institutionalized and totally dependent, or they are in society and fully independent individuals. The second thing we need to see is that the larger society, and the state specifically, is behind it all, because it is either the one institutionalizing people and empowering others, like healthcare workers, to control the lives of persons with disabilities, or because it is failing to make the community outside the institution's walls accessible by building the ramps or providing the services that would allow people to be independent. The focus on institutionalization is what leads to the focus on independent living and the understanding of state as principal barrier, but also principal facilitator in what is behind the social model of disability, which is the core theoretical perspective of disability studies. I should go on to point out that Vic Finkelstein is credited with teaching the first disability studies course ever as a lecturer at the Open University in England. Later, Mike Oliver, who is credited with popularizing the social model, will become the first official professor of disability studies at the University of Kent. Now I want to move across the Atlantic to Judy Heumann, who shares many of the same experiences as Hunt and Finkelstein, but also brings in a new element into both disability studies and disability rights. And that is the role of civil society being imbricated in the development of disability rights law. Judy Heumann is recognized today as a co-founder of the American disability movement along with Ed Roberts. Unlike people like Finkelstein and Oliver, Heumann was never an academic, and for that reason is not recognized as someone who helped develop disability studies theory. Instead, she is understood as an organizer and movement leader who was instrumental in shaping both American disability rights law and international law. That said, however, I believe Judy both has influenced disability studies and, equally important, imported disability studies theory into law. Heumann, who had polio as a child, experienced some of the same forms of segregation as Hunt and Finkelstein, but was lucky in that her parents fought for her to be placed in regular schools and to attend university, where she studied education. When she graduated in 1969, however, she was denied a teacher's license by the city of New York and ended up suing the city in Heumann versus the Board of Education of New York on the basis of discrimination and denial of her civil rights, the case was decided in her favor in 1970. This legal suit specifically built upon the American civil rights movement against racial discrimination and the women's movement based on gender discrimination, which had both successfully created movements that were ultimately met by responsive states that were able not only to reform the law and protect people under it, but also mobilize resources to implement legal changes. After seeing the success of this strategy, Judy went on to establish Disabled in Action in New York as the first membership-based disabled persons organization in the United States for the express purpose of mobilizing persons with disabilities to participate in legal advocacy and hold the state accountable. The mission of Disabled in Action is to raise consciousness among people with or without disabilities concerning ableism, paternalism, and derogatory attitudes, as well as laws and customs that oppress disabled individuals in American society, to enact and enforce effective legislation and budget initiatives promoting our ability to live independently by mandating equal access, to provide the organizational basis for disabled activists to join in effective unified political action. So Disabled in Action's mission statement is exemplary for what Western disabled people's organizations have sought to do from 1970 forward. Even more importantly, for the purposes of this talk, is that the legal advocacy of disabled persons organizations in the West became the model for the civil society provisions in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. You see, after Judy began her advocacy in New York, she moved to Berkeley, where she also founded a legal advocacy NGO that pushed for civil rights provisions in the 1973 American Rehabilitation Act, and more importantly, the 1999 Americans with Disabilities Act. Following that work, Human became the World Bank's first advisor on disability and development in 2002, a position she used to organize the Global Partnership for Disability and Development, drawing together networks of disabled people's organizations and progressive rights-based international NGOs from around the world. The network then became the primary advocate for and principal advisor on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was adopted 4 years later, and, as I argue, institutionalized political advocacy as the singular understanding of civic participation for disabled people's organizations. These Anglo-American pioneers of disability rights laid out the foundation of what Heyer called the rights model of disability. Their thinking and approach to disability rights stirred a disability revolution globally, being taken from the United States to Germany and Japan, and eventually to the United Nations. In 2006, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted by the UN General Assembly. The CRPD adopts the rights model of disability comprehensively and marks the institutionalization of normative claims coming out of the international disability rights movement. In today's talk, I want to highlight 3 central ethos of the CRPD's conceptions and practices of disability rights, which are the social model definition, the right to independent living, and its civil society mandate. Firstly, the CRPD adopts a revolutionary social model definition of disability that evolved from the international disability rights movement. And we can see it here. Here it is. In its first article, the CRPD suggests persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. This definition institutionalizes the social model conception about recognizing social, attitudinal, and institutional barriers' role on disabled persons rather than individual impairment. The second ethos is the right to independent living, importing from the Anglo-American movement towards independent living. The Article 19 of the CRPD stipulates that states parties to the present convention recognize the equal rights of all persons with disabilities to live in the community with choices equal to others, and shall take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate full enjoyment by persons with disabilities of this right in their full inclusion and participation in the community. Lastly, as indicated by its slogan, "Nothing about us without us," the CRPD's rights model connotes a strong civil society mandate. The CRPD is arguably the exemplar of the most advanced human rights treaty in terms of integrating the role for civil society in the making of the convention, as well as the monitoring role for persons with disabilities and DPOs as their representative organizations. Show that. This is the civil society mandate. The argument that I hope to successfully make today is that the disability experience in the West regarding institutionalization, the role of the state in creating as well as eliminating disability, and the role of civil society as legal advocate represents the foundational assumptions of disability studies as a discipline and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as an international human rights instrument. As disability studies as a discipline is expanded beyond North America and Western Europe, and the CRPD has been promoted around the world, it has effectively universalized a specific set of Western experiences without questioning if those assumptions hold true in other cultures and societies around the world. Why this is important is that it prevents disability studies theory from being able to recognize other types of disability experiences, and the CRPD poses problems in recognizing and legitimating the full diversity of disabled persons organizations around the world. Slowly, critiques of the social model, independent living, and the legal advocacy role of DPOs have begun rolling out. Firstly, scholars have begun emerging, arguing that the social model needs to be reworked to recognize agency, or the lack thereof, within cultures that promote interdependent relations rather than individual independence. Maria Bergs, for example, argues for a South African social model based on the Zulu concept of Ubuntu, which broadly means togetherness, and more specifically means that people develop an agentic self through their relationships with one another. From this perspective, disablement is caused by the failure of people to be incorporated into interdependent relations with others, rather than disablement being caused by a denial of individual independence. In fact, Bergs argues that whether we are looking at South Africa or the West, independence and autonomy is a myth and results in disability studies, their theory, being unable to recognize what agency means for persons whom independent living will never be a possibility. Similarly, Moyo argues for a Venezuelan social model based on a collectivist culture, where again, the agentic self develops within family and community relationships rather than as a separate, independent, autonomous self. From that point of view, disablement would be rejection from the family rather than a family presenting barriers to an individual living independently from it. Along this vein, there is a small but growing anthropological literature looking at the disability experience within indigenous communities as diverse as the Navajo Nation in North America through to the Maasai tribe in Kenya, where persons with profound physical and intellectual disabilities are fully integrated into the community and married, raising livestock, and so on, things close to unimaginable in the West. And they are doing it because they are immersed in interdependent, multi-generational families where everyone is recognized as a potential contributor to the collective, but also as owing to responsibilities to aid and contribute to one another in fulfilling that role. And so the social model has this idea that there's a clear separation between the self and society. It is incapable of understanding cultures where the self and the community are inseparable. Now I want to turn to independent living, which comes directly out of the social model analysis where the self and the society are clearly separate. As a model of practice in the West, it is organized around the principle that the goal for persons with disabilities is to be able to live alone as individuals in society through personal assistance and so forth. In short, it takes living alone as a measure of success. And in many cultures around the world, to live alone and outside of one's family is not only rare, but strange, a sign that something has gone wrong rather than something has gone right. A study regarding a European Union program to promote the right to independent living in Malta found that almost 100% of young people in their 20s up to their early 30s lived at home with their parents in Malta. Yet Malta was being told it was violating the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities because they were not doing enough to get young people with disabilities out of their parents' home and into their own apartment. Similarly, a study looking at attempts to export independent living from Japan to Vietnam found that the failure of the model to take into account families created profound resistance from persons with disabilities themselves, as well as their families at the idea of separation from them. Again, independent living as a model began as a response to institutionalization, which is about separating and segregating people from their families and communities. But now it is ironically being used to remove people who are integrated into their families and communities and have them live separately. The last piece I'd like to critique is the narrow understanding of disabled people's organizations as legal advocates. And this critique is where the majority of my work has been focused and where I'd like to present my case studies. But before doing so, I just want to broadly make the argument that this model for DPOs is a profoundly Western understanding of civil society. And I would argue not only assumes a democratic state that has institutionalized political and civil rights, but it also assumes a wealthy state that has the resources necessary for the implementation of the social and economic rights that civil society movements like the disability movement demand. Given that there are actually relatively few fully democratic developed nations, it is impossible to fully universalize this model of civil society. Instead, civil society and disabled persons organizations must be far more diverse to meet the needs of persons with disabilities in states and in states where they don't have this model of civil society. So the first case study I'd like to do, and the majority of my own research has been on Nicaragua, which is a small country in Central America and is the second poorest country next to Haiti in the Western Hemisphere. When I first became interested in Nicaragua, it was shortly after Nicaragua signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. At that time, a large number of international NGOs entered Nicaragua for the purposes of supporting Nicaraguan DPOs to do legal advocacy, specifically according to the model of civil society outlined in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This included new disability organizations and old organizations, all of whom were now being trained in legal advocacy and funded for legal advocacy to hold the Nicaraguan government accountable to the implementation of the convention, which Nicaragua was states parties to. In particular, they were receiving funding to really push inclusive education, which Nicaragua was trying to do, but often failing miserably at. Imagine classrooms of 50 students, half of whom don't have a desk, in poorly lit concrete buildings, and then adding students with intellectual disabilities, hearing difficulties, low vision, and so forth to that mix. It wasn't going well, and many of the grassroots associations were being told by the international community to advocate for change, were being told that they needed to advocate harder on the government and call them out for violating the education rights of children with disabilities. And while I was doing this research, I remember having a conversation, having a conversation with the founder of the local association of the blind. And he expressed exasperation when he talked about the pressure that his organization was receiving from international organizations. And he said to me, am I, as a disabled person, not getting my rights because the government does not want to fulfill it? The problem is that when a state is poor, even if it wants to hand me my rights, for example, access to education, but does not have the ability to train their teachers to take care of you in the classroom if you are deaf, blind, a child with intellectual disabilities, is it logical to call that a human rights violation? So we were specifically referencing the fact that Nicaragua was a poor state. The local DPOs recognized that their advocacy was bound to fail in light of Nicaragua's poverty because no matter how hard they advocated, the government simply did not have the money to make the changes they were demanding. To put the economy of Nicaragua in perspective, the GDP of Nicaragua at the time was just $8 billion for a country of about 6 million people. The University of Washington, where I work, has an operating budget of $9 billion. And at that level, we constantly feel that we don't have enough money. Even if Nicaragua were willing, it cannot create the social change promised by the CRPD. And the civil society model outlined in the CRPD will never be successful. DPOs that advocate for many of the human rights outlined in the CRPD, especially rights to inclusive education, an accessible built environment, a basic living standard, assume a state with sufficient resources to implement those rights. In the many cases where states don't have those resources, DPOs must find something else to do other than legal advocacy, other than marching in the street. In Nicaragua, that same Association of the Blind, that same Association of the Blind, where the leader saw little value in calling out the government for failing to implement the right to inclusive education, was actively educating students with disabilities themselves. They were doing it as part of their obligations in civil society, in a civil society that was very communitarian. The origins of the Association of the Blind, in fact, began in the 1980s when the founder was blinded during the Nicaraguan Civil War. He was sent to Cuba for rehabilitation, and while there, learned Braille. When he came back to Nicaragua and met other blind persons, he realized he was the only one who could read Braille, and subsequently started teaching others and founded a school where the blind taught the blind to read Braille, use the bus, work at a job, and in many cases gave them the skills that allowed them later to go to regular schools. The Association of the Blind was also involved in job development and placement and so forth, different ways of mutual aid and helping one another. And so they saw greater value in that than they saw in advocating to the state and marching in the street as they were being told to by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, right? And so this is part of the diversity of civil society that is missed by disability studies today. The second case study I'd like to present is about US prisons. So Nicaragua as a case study reveals assumptions about the resource environment inherent in the belief that advocacy can effectively bring about change. It also demonstrates the ways in which civil society in more communitarian cultural contexts are able to do many of the things that we expect from the state in the West. In that way, it shows that persons with disabilities through their DPOs can be agents for change in the daily lives of their members in ways other than rights advocacy. Now I want to turn to a seemingly unlikely place, prisons in the US system. And I believe this is important because to think globally about disability rights and disability studies means also looking within the West, not just at other places around the world. The civil society mandate of disability rights not only assumes that states are wealthy, but they assume that states will be responsive to the type of advocacy typical in Western-style democracies. Prisoners, however, represent a special group within the population in the United States that do not have their full civil and political rights. Prisons also represent one of the places in the US where persons with disabilities are most overrepresented. Official estimates from the US Department of Justice report that more than 26% of federal inmates and 31% of inmates in state prisons are persons with disabilities. Those estimates, however, are likely quite low. Several small-scale studies, for example, have found that more than 3/4 of the American prison population are persons with disabilities when taking into account mental health disabilities and intellectual disabilities. Given this overrepresentation in the prison population, it should be no surprise that prisons have increasingly become concerned with how to manage persons with disabilities. It has also become a requirement of US law. In 2006, the US Supreme Court ruled that the Americans with Disabilities Act, the main disability rights vehicle in the US, applies to prisons. Because of the ADA, prisons are now required to provide reasonable accommodations to inmates with disabilities. Ironically, this includes providing personal care assistance in an attempt to promote independent living for inmates within the prison system, where there is no actual independence. Beginning in 2015, I began a small-scale study interviewing prisoners with disabilities and other prisoners that had been hired as their personal care assistants to see how disability rights functioned in prison. Similar to Nicaragua, they did not function very well, but for a different reason. Whereas in Nicaragua, there was too little state in the sense of there not being enough resources. In prisons, there was too much state in that the prison system in the US is a repressive force that is unresponsive to advocacy. In interviews with prisoners with disabilities, I learned that the prison guards or corrections officers viewed accommodations as a special privilege rather than a right. As such, it was something that was frequently withheld. Furthermore, I found that when accommodations were provided, they could easily be taken away as a form of punishment. This was especially true when prisoners with disabilities advocated for themselves. Within the California state prison system, where I was doing my research, inmates can make specific appeals for their rights through a petition or appeals process called a 409. The form is the 409 form. I found, however, if prisoners advocated for the rights, they could open themselves up for harassment from the state. For example, corrections officers assumed anyone who sought accommodations was trying to get a privilege and would harass them for that. And so I have one quote from one of my interviewees that said, "I've seen corrections officers or guards who, when someone clearly has a disability, the CO would say, 'Oh, you're just kidding. You don't need anything. You're just trying to get something from the state.'" A major form of harassment that occurred within the prison was that if a prisoner filled out a 409 appeal that their disability rights were being violated, guards would take away their accommodations as a form of punishment. One of the major tasks of personal care assistants was to either push wheelchairs for inmates who needed them or to carry their trays in the cafeteria if they were unable to easily walk alone. Here, one personal care assistant explained that after prisoners made official complaints and advocated for themselves, the guard told the personal care attendants to withhold services. Quote, "These older guys, they really have nothing to do with anything, so they like to go and get involved in legal stuff and file 409s or official complaints. The sergeant was getting written up by the consensus of all the disabled inmates. So his way at getting back at them was to pretty much say, screw you guys, these younger dudes, these personal care assistants that are trying to help you as personal care assistants. Hey, check this out. The personal care assistants can no longer help these disabled guys. They're grown men, they can get their own stuff. Don't let me see you helping them." So he actually ordered the personal care assistants to no longer help them, which often meant that persons with disabilities could not eat because they could not carry their own trays. In the face of a state that did not recognize their rights, however, informal networks of interdependence formed. I spoke to one inmate with a severe hearing impairment. As a Native American in the prison, he found other Native Americans to look after him and hear for him. In turn, he looked out for others in his group, especially those with intellectual disabilities. All right. And he explained, it wouldn't matter what reason other Native Americans were in prison for. We took care of our elders and the ones that were particularly considered weak. It wouldn't matter if they had a disability, a physical disability. Well, the thing that's unique about prison is when you do find somebody that you're close to, then you know you got that person's back and they got yours unconditionally, right or wrong. And so you trust. And so I surrounded myself with people that, 2 or 3 people that I always knew would listen for my name and would hear for me. This describes kind of the Native Americans engaging in this behavior. But most remarkably were other inmates with disabilities who would seek each other out and ask to be assigned to the same cell in order to be able to help one another in relations of interdependence. So here's another quote. There was just those 2 ADA or disabled guys and their cellies, their cellmates, pretty much took care of anything that was more than, almost everything. Just your cellie. Your cellie is your kind of guy in the prison. So they really took care of each other. Now, these are not formal civil society organizations or DPOs, but they represent the types of responses that persons with disabilities make in the face of states that do not recognize rights advocacy as a legitimate form of civic behavior, right? And so I'm using these two case studies to kind of illustrate the limits of disability studies theory as originally conceived, with its focus on independence and individualism, as well as the focus of disability rights law on the idea of civil society having the singular role of advocacy rather than self-right. So, as I'm working to develop a model of global disability studies, and Shusin and I are working together to develop global disability studies as a field, there are really three things that we're interested in. The first is recognizing agency as something that is achieved through interdependent relationships rather than individual independence. As such, the social model needs to view disablement as the failure of family or community to recognize the mutual dependency that everyone shares with one another, including the dependence of persons with disabilities on others and their dependence on persons with disabilities. Secondly, global disability studies needs to go beyond a focus on independent living to instead focus on care, especially mutual care, social support, and so forth. In effect, it needs to think about interdependent living. Finally, global disability studies needs to recognize the full diversity of civil society and the ways in which disabled persons support their members and address their needs in contexts where the state is either incapable of institutionalizing their rights or uninterested, right? And so we need to understand the full diversity of civil society in regards to persons with disabilities. And I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think many of the audience, member of the audience, we are more familiar with, the traditional narrative that the Western or individualistic CRPD ideology does not really working very well in many third world. But I think your second case study is more interesting than to many of us. Right, the same model does not working very well, even within the United States. So I think that's a really fascinating presentation. I think it is very helpful for the audience to have a global perspective and what we will explore more in the future as a more broader perspective. And our second speaker, our discussant, and also have a mixed background. Dr. Cui has both educational and lived experience in the United States and in China. So let's see what Dr. Cui would say as a response.
Excellent.
You have a 10 or 15 minutes. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you. It is my honor to share my thoughts over here on the topic, and disability studies and legal education, rights to inclusive education are my main focused areas. And I think Professor Meyers' talk offered us great insight into why a global perspective of disability studies is critical for international human rights laws to be better localized. Because culturally appropriate perspective is such an important issue, so I thought it would be appropriate and helpful if I share some of the perspectives related to the topic in China context. So within my sharing, and I think I will relate my points to Professor Meyers' arguments. So in the past 15 years, because of my work at Harvard Law School Project on Disability, because I chair our China program, and I have been able to have regular engagement with disability organizations in China, among others, including DPOs, parent organizations, and service organizations. Integrating disability studies into legal education and other domains and have been a big focus of my research, teaching, and pro bono work. So a little bit background information, given the huge disability population in China, with estimated 75% in rural areas and with a large percentage living in poverty. Poverty alleviation has been a focus of the state's initiatives. But the picture of what constitutes the poverty of people with disabilities is complicated. I would argue that when people would argue it's an economic issue or political issue or some other issues, I would argue that at the bottom, the biggest barriers people with disabilities face are attitudinal. So it's the earth of other problems that grew out of it. I think it is fair to say that the medical and charity model of disability has been dominating in disability history in China. There has been transformational development in the public understanding of disability in recent years. The new law on the construction of accessible environment, which will be entering into force in September this year, is one of the typical examples of society's efforts to improve environment and services for people with disabilities. And also this benefits goes beyond people with disabilities to seniors and other populations. So to some extent, this idea of accessibility in this law goes to universal design, nature. So that benefits each member that needs accessibility to be able to participate in society. So China is one of the earliest states to sign and ratify the UN Convention on the rights of people with disabilities with no reservations, as we probably all know. So in the past 15 years, since the CRPD entered into force in China, there has been two states reports on the implementation of people of CRPD. The initial report submitted in 2010 and the second and third combined reports submitted in 2018. So some of the earliest DPOs embraced the social and rights model of disability embedded in the CRPD quickly, and use it for their advocacy work. But for people with disability, for people, especially the general public, to understand that the social model of disability is the floor, not the ceiling, as my colleague, Professor Michael Stein put it, to address disability issues is not easy because ableism is very difficult to be rooted out. So this is a reality people with disabilities face in every corner of their life in society. So DPOs work to promote equal participation of people with disabilities through their representative organizations, which is emphasized in the UN Convention, take culturally appropriate ways. One big aspect is their ongoing efforts to raise public awareness of disability rights and promote understanding of disability. Another aspect is to advocate for informed decision-making by people with disabilities so that limited funding, investment, and resource distribution can be for the best interest of people with disabilities and society. So the battle over here is how to make the good use of limited resources rather than increase resources, because the second part is more difficult. So this is very important because when disability work begin to catch the attention of society, disability industry kicks in right away. So one of the examples is the rapid growth of the medical or clinical nature of rehabilitation services. So over here, we see a problem of not the lack of resources, but the wrong use of resources influenced by attitudinal issues, ableism. So, and those rehabilitation services, they can be both private and public. So it is parents' dream, parents who are shaped by environmental attitude towards disability. So their dream is to fix their children's disabilities on top of everything else they can send their children to. So one of the case studies I have been doing is how to integrate rehabilitation services into early childhood education. So they are not two separate things when parents and have to struggle about how to find time to give rehabilitation to their children while at the same time send their children to education. So this has been a huge problem and parents have to deal with. So another one is probably the increasing funding for research projects scholars in the field can apply. In most cases, DPO's persistent efforts for equal participation are for whatever resources available to be helpful for the social inclusion and equal opportunities of people with disabilities as they claim to be. So another point I want to briefly mention is about civil society in China. So I won't touch the condition of civil societies in China. I want to focus my topic on disability organizations over here. Disability organizations in China are not always on the same page as Professor Meyers also mentioned, and which is the case, probably it's a global issue and it is normal. So one of the issues is different approaches DPOs, parent organizations, and service organizations take to promote the professional development of their organizations. Advocacy work of DPOs taking the basis in the social and rights model of disability is critical and important for children with disabilities and their parents, and for parents to provide inclusive and a supportive family environment. Between these organizations, there exists constant battle between what is profitable and beneficial. So who is the focus of the services? So for parents other service providers, they have to constantly examine where they stand to be able to provide the best programs they define for people with disabilities, to promote their social inclusion, to protect their rights. So the real issue is not the battle itself, but it's about if the organizations integrate an organizational redefining goal into their professional development strategies to examine, as I said, how their work impact the lives of people with disabilities. So to conclude, for people with disabilities to use the CRPD for their trainings, for their advocacy, although there are limited formal channels for DPOs to participate in decision-making and the disability policy development. And here, so I say formal channels. It's not that they cannot do it. There are limitations. So its impact on public awareness of disability, equal participation in society, supported decision-making, and other important issues. To some extent, Chinese culture values interdependence of family members and also in communities. Families are the main caregivers of their children with disabilities. The main idea of independent living people with disabilities pursue over here is that they can gain support to make decisions and choices for themselves. It's about their decency. It's about their quality of life. They can have a life with their family members. It's not special for Chinese families, 3 generations to live under the same roof. But independent living takes a different definition over here. So because people with disabilities experience patronizing attitude in society, and ableism has huge impact, as I mentioned earlier. And for people with disabilities to make their own choices for their lives is not easy. It's probably less about physically where they can live. It's about how to maintain themselves as an independent human being, to protect their decency, to make choices. For example, parents, they constantly fight about where to send their children for education, special schools, segregated schools, or general schools. What if general schools cannot provide professional support for their children to have meaningful learning experience? And for those who graduate from middle schools, should they go to blind schools or go to regular high schools so they can participate in college entrance examination, to be integrated in society, to work with others? So those are huge issues about independent living and their inclusion in society. So decision-making and choice-making is very important in how to define independent living for people with disabilities in China. So preparing hearts for DPOs, although there are lack of formal channels to participate in decision-making at the state or provincial city level. But there's a huge part to prepare the hearts and minds of the general public, so that disability communities, their representative organizations, can help people to understand the roots of the problems that people with disabilities face, and have a better understanding of disability rights law framework. When they see a new law coming out, they can understand what's right and wrong in it. So this is a very daunting task, and this is a very important role DPOs can play. So to hold other disability organizations accountable, to think about their work and the impact of their work on the lives of the population they claim to serve. And this is also a very important aspect of how to localize CRPD in China context and beyond. So I'll stop here and give the floor back to Chenpo. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Chui. It's a great response because not just providing some background information to anyone who are not familiar with these issues, but also respond to a major theme from Professor Meyers talked about the interdependence, right, within the family, especially in China. So that control and support always come hand in hand. I think that's something many of us would explore more in the future. Now we have 15 minutes, and we hope we can have as many questions from the floor. And please remember using the microphone when you make your question. And it's better, maybe more helpful for you to give a very brief introduction of yourself, where you come from. You are a social worker, you are a lawyer, or whatever. And please make clear who your question is made to, or both, right, of course. Is there any questions from the floor? Or online? Sorry, I need to speak in Chinese. 大家可以用中文提问啊，那是会有翻译还是我来？OK， 就大家用中文提问就可以啊，因为我们会有同声传译的服务。然后然后可以简要的介绍一下自己，然后包括自己的问题是提给谁。So maybe many people may need a minute to prepare the questions. So I have questions myself with the privilege of the moderator.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when your research about the Nicaragua civil society, and actually I'm in the middle of reading a book actually. And what interests me about you mentioned in the presentation, I'm curious, have you know anything? Maybe not just a formal research, but have you heard of anything like the grassroots DPO in some more authoritarian states, for example, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and obviously something like China, some place like China, yeah. North Korea. So they may face different kind of difficulties about their organizing their work. So do you have anything to share in this respect?
Yeah. Yes, to a certain extent, Nicaragua, especially since I actually did my research, is becoming more authoritarian.
Okay.
But one of the things that I think is interesting is that a model of civil society doing self-help can both function as a way of persons with disabilities making up for the lack of resources of the state, but also preventing the state from having control over their lives. So, for example, organizing your own school means that you're no longer inviting the state into the provision of education, but you're able to control that yourselves. Within the United States, there's actually a new area of literature forming around disability justice. And there's a disability justice movement organized around or led by disabled persons of color, as well as LGBTQ persons with disabilities. And many of the arguments they make are arguments around self-help because of their historic distrust of the state. And so I think actually self-help interdependence is a way of insulating yourself from the state being invited into your lives.
So in that context, maybe resources is the issue then. In that context.
Yeah,
great. Thank you very much. Is there any 大家有什么问题吗？其他有没有朋友？
My question is to Professor Meyers, and I'm Huang Yi from Shenzhen University, and also I'm the director of Shenzhen Autism Society. So it's an organization providing service for people with developmental disabilities. And my question is about your research in prison. It's quite interesting because prison is sometimes the least place that we will think about independent living. Yeah. But you have talked about the experience that how kind of independent living and interdependent living is practiced in the prison. So based on the social cultural context in China and most East Asian countries, we have to admit that we still have many institutionalized service. And sometimes the institutional-based caring is perhaps the only choice for some people with disabilities. So my question is, what can we learn from the experience in prison, which is another institution, that how can we improve the quality of service if the service is happened in the institution, or how can we kind of integrate some independent living factors or elements into the institutional-based services if it is still the choice for us? Thank you.
Sure, yeah. A couple of initial thoughts. First, prisons and all institutions are quite complex social environments, right? And so I think the emphasis of independent living is the ability of people to be able to make choices for themselves, right? And there's quite a bit of decision-making that occurs within prisons. There are, jobs and employment. There are different groups that you can join. You know, there are prayer groups and art groups and so on and so forth. I think looking at the experiences in the prison that I was looking at in California, something that really struck me is the need for fostering more formal relationships among persons with disabilities, right? So what I saw was, you know, was very informal networks of care where people found and sought each other out. But there is room in prison to actually kind of formalize those networks so that people can meet on a regular basis and, you know, have the room to actually, you know, form a group with its own vision and mission and so forth, right? And so I think within any institution, allowing the space for people to meet on a regular basis and you know, decide what they want to do as an organization, I think is something that's actually vital. Yeah. And you know, just as part of that, something that really struck me is that in the United States, there's a very vital disability civil society, right? Of advocacy organizations and so on and so forth, all over the place, but none of them had any kind of relationship with prisons. And given the fact that persons with disabilities are so overrepresented in the prison, it really shows a lack of engagement that I think is, you know, quite profound and unfortunate.
还有其他？打开一下麦克风，
那个麦斯教授你好，那个我是一个可能18年的肢体障碍者，在生活的过程中，我是发现的确，我觉得越来越发现这社会的障碍不来源于我们身体，其实来源于就是社会认知的障碍。其实我一直觉得，可能我们站在就说是身心障碍者的角度来说，我觉得社会的认知反而是需要去扫盲。就是说，我有句话是叫，就是说是障碍凭想象而放大，认知因不解而残疾。其实更多的就是认知上的问题。我们现在在发起一个，就是号召社会走入到我们的生活场景。比如说，我们现在发起一个轮椅上的半天，就是说你可以走进来，就是体验交换一下场景，体验半天的轮椅生活，对真实的生活如何去那个真正的了解我们所需。因为的确刚刚教授他们都说到了，就是说仅有的资源其实因为不了解，导致大量的资源错配，就是说那种所以说我想知道，就是说基于这种就是说这种场景呢场景的构造，就是在因为我一直在国内，就我的视野是比较局限，只是说是站在我们就残有的角度我想去做点什么东西。但是在国外有没有更成熟的，就是说有没有这种就是说是活动这种场景呢？就是让社会走进来，而不是说很多人就是说残健共融让残友走出去。但实际上双向奔赴，应该是社会要走进来，先了解一下如何在为特殊的一些群体提供一些服务，让那个我们老话叫那种好钢用到刀刃上，资源毕竟有限。谢谢。
Okay, yeah, that's an excellent question, right? And I think for attitudinal change, there's something we talk about in sociology called contact theory. That when you make contact with someone that is different from you, that's where attitudes and stigma begins to change, right? And I think you have a tremendous insight in the idea that it shouldn't always be incumbent on the person with disabilities to go out into society and be part of that way, but instead to invite society into their community. You know, certainly at places like the University of Washington, there are students with disability organizations that will put together social events, whether it's a movie night or some other kind of club activity where they make it open for all students and invite all students to come to their space and their activities. And I think anything that is, you know, social in nature and can bring people into a space with more persons with disabilities, I think is an excellent route for change and for addressing attitudes. Yeah.
Thank you. We still have time for one question or two. Okay. 甄姐，你可以打开麦克风。
哦，好，那个，我是沈成晴，来自中国残障人和社群少数派。我想问一个，刚刚教授说，在资源有限的情况下，大家互帮互助。我现在做的就是这样的事，但是我经常找不到这个资源何处，可能在国外，在一些小的地方，都是怎样去促进这些资源能够给到社群，给到人？我想问的就是这样。
Yeah. I think the best way to make do with limited resources is for people together to produce their own resources, right? I think the volunteerism of people is oftentimes an untapped resource, right? And so I think anything that organizations of persons with disabilities can do to try to organize their own projects and show that with a little bit of investment from the state or from other communities, they can do more is a way to really expand those resources, right? So I think showing that as an organization, you are effective at implementing your own projects is a way to invite those projects to be invested in.
Thank you very much. I think it is about the time. And thank you again, and thank you for doctors online. And I think, is there anything you want to bring? Oh, so one more question. Sorry, I didn't see any. 还有一个问题啊，不 ，OK， 抱歉没有看到。
Is there a last question? Yeah.
是会做哦 ，sorry， 手语就是手语翻译，然后就是所以这边不动，就是手语翻译这边会把他的提问出来，因为是在
开始没有选重新开始。好，马老师说，我是做无障碍手语服务的，这个组织的，我的目的就是我们公司的组织就是做手语服务。我现在就做的是这种无障碍的手语服务。那么最大的问题是什么？关于聋人的服务，政府的话，没有不重视。
就是如果没有提供好的资金，其实是无法做到好的服务。那要如何去发展手语方面的服务呢？好，重新再问一下，因为在我们无障碍我们的公司里面，我们是针对做手语翻译服务的工作。那政府呢，其实并没有很重视手语翻译这件事情，所以当他不重视的时候，他就不会提供资金，不会给预算。那要怎么去发展更好的手语翻译服务呢？我想问的是 Stephen 教授这个，比方说，因为我们聋人自己工作也不太好，其实然后在因为政策上的问题，我们能够获得的工资很少，然后还需要有手语翻译去陪同。然后也不能一直都是靠volunteer，也不能一直靠志愿者去做，然后所以这样子没有办法去做，所以就想要问Professor Stephen， 那要如何去发展
？Yeah. I'm not specifically familiar with the way in which resources are distributed with your governments, right? So I can't give specific advice around that. One thing that I think is tremendously exciting is that with the current generation in the United States, sign language is becoming the second most popular they call it a foreign language. So all students in American secondary schools are required to study a foreign language. Spanish is the most popular. Sign language is the second most popular. And then you have French, German, Mandarin, so on and so forth, right? And so what that has meant is that there's been a tremendous spread of interest in sign language within society, and it's something that actually people want more opportunities to engage in sign language, right? And so I think the more that can be done by deaf organizations to popularize the use of sign language within the larger society will help people recognize its value in it being provided, and more opportunities for engagement with the deaf community, which should hopefully then lead to businesses and others seeing it as a vital resource. That's all I can really offer.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all your time, and that's the end of our first session. Thank you very much.